Welcome to the 63rd episode of Delete Your Accounts. I'm Roqayah Shamsuddin. My co-host is Kumars Salahi. Every week we're going to talk about important stories from worlds of politics and pop culture, both on and offline, in a way that doesn't bore the shit out of you. So how are you doing today, Kumars?
I'm doing good. Still riding high off of yesterday, which was the last ever Game of Thrones Twin Peaks doubleheader, right? Given that this season of Game of Thrones is over, and then the new Twin Peaks run is just a 18-episode limited run series. So I'm excited about this because, I'm, as I've talked about before ad nauseum, I'm alienated from a lot of mainstream American institutions like sports and music festivals and stuff like that. So it takes a lot to really get me to have specific rituals around like doing specific things on different days. And Sunday night is for the TVs, basically, for me. And So despite what a lot of the snooty McMonacles on left Twitter have been saying, I enjoy the fuck out of Game of Thrones. And the way this season has ended was no exception to me. There's obviously some weak plot lines, but my God, the spectacle, right? Like the 75% of dialogue, and I know you don't watch it, so I'm really just talking to the fans here. The 75% of dialogue that does land, right? The spectacle, the consistent shock effect of the melodrama, like the commitment to like grit and seriousness and like a materialist vision of fantasy, the intricacy of the narrative construction, just period, even if the individual strands can be weak, and no spoilers, so I'm not going to talk about what actually happened in the episode, but Sean T. Collins, who is our official film critic over here at DYA, has a great take on it. Actually, you should go ahead and read Sean T. Collins' take on why Game of Thrones is anti-war. I don't particularly endorse that view, but I think it's more true than not. It's certainly more true than the vulgar view that Game of Thrones is just like smut and nothing more than porn, both literally and in terms of violence. So yeah, I don't know. I want to throw it back to you because I know you're not a viewer, so this must be driving you absolutely nuts.
Yeah, I've watched maybe one episode and not even in its entirety, and I don't know if that's really fair to the show to blow it off because of that. In terms of, what was it, Twin Peaks, I also have not watched the show. I used to think, I made a joke, which it's honest, that I used to think Twin Peaks was like a Faulty Towers type of show.
Like with John Cleese, the sitcom with John Cleese.
Yeah, with John Cleese. Yeah, exactly. And everyone was like, yeah, you're not entirely wrong. I thought it was a comedy, okay? But I'm not really into it. I used to be into The Walking Dead, and then it just got so shitty. And Sean T. Collins, he also wrote something on The Walking Dead that I thought it was amazing about just how boring the show has gotten and how drawn out things are. It was a while ago, but we'll link to that as well. But yeah, I'm not really into TV at the moment, especially because I'm getting ready to go to the US, and yeah, but maybe I'm going to download some Game of Thrones for the plane ride, 'cause it's like 16 hours, so we'll see.
Yeah, it is really one of those things that if you get into it, it becomes its own world and kind of like Lost. Not quite to the extent of Lost, but it's kind of that same phenomenon.
I haven't even watched Lost. Can you believe that? I'm so bad.
The basic principle is that like it's not necessarily a function even of how good the show is. It's just that by the end of the episode, the cliffhanger is so absolutely frustrating that you're like, I'm just gonna watch one more. I know it's late, but it can't possibly be more nail-biting than this. And lo and behold, 45 minutes later, you're still on the edge of your fucking seat, and it's 4 a.m., and you still can't go to sleep. And Game of Thrones is definitely, for me, in that range. Nothing will ever touch Lost for sheer overachieving in terms of how addictive it was versus how good it was. Yeah. But Game of Thrones is good. The Twin Peaks, and I've said this before on, I think, bonus shows, but my opinion of the new Twin Peaks is that it's just the way that story had to end was in a David Lynch film, not in a sort of a return to the cuddly soap opera, with cutesy small town folk, that we all sort of know and love from the first couple of seasons. And even by the end of the second season, I think a lot of the life and the charm, of the show is gone. Basically, my milestone is whenever Heather Graham shows up to be the completely unsatisfying love interest to Agent Cooper. And now we're seeing that play out. I think a lot of people have already tuned out despite being huge fans of the show. But I'm also hugely for it. So what else is on your mind, Roqayah?
So I'm sure many of you listened to our episode with Taryn Fivick and Lone Tran on the protest and overturning of the Confederate statue in Durham, North Carolina. We have a small update with action that you can take to show solidarity with comrades who've been arrested. You can call the Durham Sheriff's Office at 919-560-0897 and demand that the charges be dropped and they be released.
Absolutely. And we encourage you all to do that.
Yeah, I'm even going to call, and I'm in Sydney, Australia. You can do it from anywhere. So please do, because it does have an impact if there's like a big swelling of people calling in and busying their phone lines.
And 11 people have been arrested so far. So a lot of people are counting on us. And in sort of a related vein, the interview that we did this week is something special. It's the first time for us. We are actually not involved at all, Roqayah and I. The debate that we are about to present to you is a debate on violence against Nazis, violence as an anti-fascist strategy, and it is between George Ciccariello-Maher, previous guest on the show and professor at Drexel University, and we also have Lee Fang, who is a reporter and writer at The Intercept. Moderating very neutrally will be Josh Holland of The Nation, and they are going to get into the nitty-gritty, explore all of the juicy and not so juicy details of what the debate over violence and anti-fascist action is about, what it means for left strategy. We have not heard the interview, so we're not going to comment on it, but we hope you enjoy it. Hope we do too.
Yeah, like Kumar said, I haven't heard the episode yet, and I'm extremely excited to hear it, so let's get to it.
Let's do it.
Welcome, I'm Joshua Holland. I write for The Nation, and I also host a podcast called Politics and Reality Radio. We're going to talk about Antifa and the politics of resisting fascists and white supremacists. We're joined by George Ciccariello-Maher. He teaches radical theory and politics at Drexel University in Philadelphia, and he's also the author of We Created Chavez, A People's History of the Venezuelan Revolution, and Building the Commune, Radical Democracy in Venezuela. Lee Fang is a journalist with a longstanding interest in how public policy is influenced by organized interest groups and big money in politics. He's the author of The Machine, a book on right-wing movements and the Republican Party in the aftermath of the 2008 election, and he currently works as an intrepid investigative reporter for The Intercept. Gentlemen, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having us, Joshua.
I'm glad to be here.
Thanks so much for taking the time. I was thinking that we would start by just having you give brief opening statements. I'm not going to time it, nothing formal, but just so that we all know where we're coming from. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to have this conversation with a focus on kind of pulling out the nuances rather than scoring points or doing the obnoxious shout fest thing. So I trust that you will be able to do that. George, why don't you open it up for us?
Sure. I'm really glad to be here. I think these questions are incredibly important. And I think any analysis of tactics and strategy really needs to set out, first and foremost, from an understanding of the kind of historical moment that we live in. Because I think no tactics and no strategy are sort of universally applicable. It's a question of where we are, what we confront, and how we then intervene. So if we're talking about really kind of combative tactics, provocative tactics, sort of more aggressive in-your-face tactics, I think, the first thing to say is that these don't always work, right? It's not always the moment for them. And yet, when we look at history, we see that there are historical moments in which they are incredibly effective, right? And they intervene in a specific moment, in a specific context, to really break open a space for radical organizing and thinking and movements. And I think, if we can say anything about the past few years of history, it's that this is the kind of space that we're in, not just since Trump, but since this global upsurge that begins, that includes things like Occupy and the Arab Spring and the Indignados, and that we see, later developing in the U.S., particularly around questions of race and Black Lives Matter and police murder. And so we see moments in which explosive intervention in Ferguson, in Baltimore, are key parts of what we're living through. And they've helped to open up space and drive our debates forward. And I think situating ourselves in that context helps us understand the really surprising effectiveness of certain tactics, of punching Nazis, the resurgence of Antifa as a really effective and now as a mainstream force over the last couple of weeks.
Lee?
Well, I just want to say that I'm not against disruptive, confrontational politics. Like whether it's in social movements or in journalism, confrontation is good, and stirring things up and being creative and critiquing the power structure is really vital. But, my kind of concern here really centers on this punching Nazis thing that, I think the current iteration started out earlier this year on the internet kind of as a joke, and then it's kind of taken a life of its own. And we have people now demanding that we need to go around and beat each other up. No one's really defined exactly what they mean by beating Nazis. Who fits the definition of a Nazi, how badly this person needs to be beat or attacked. It's all very vague. And just from a very practical point of view, it's not clear that this type of violence and beating people type strategy is effective for, achieving the goal of limiting the influence of Nazi organizing, right? Like, if you look at how these political violent spectacles play out, or these violent riots play out, public opinion tends to shift towards sympathizing with the victim of political violence and against the aggressor in terms of political violence. And we see that playing out over and over again in recent years. In Ferguson, with mostly nonviolent protesters putting their hands up saying, "Don't shoot," it looked like the state of Missouri was declaring war on those protesters. So again, the public opinion shifted to sympathize with the protesters against the aggressors. In Berkeley, it was the other way around. It looked a lot like these Antifa protesters were going out and just beating students. And so people sympathized with the alt-right, with Milo, and that became a call to arms on the alt-right. And you saw conservatives going back and back to Berkeley for more and more confrontations because they felt victimized. And I think Charlottesville is another great example. I think anyone with half a brain would see that these white nationalist groups were clearly the aggressor. They went out and beat anti-racist activists. They killed an anti-racist activist. So that mobilized public opinion against these white nationalist groups. I'm worried that people will take this punching Nazi thing, instead of it being just an internet joke, take it, too seriously. They will go out and beat someone half to death. Or, I'm seeing a lot of people saying on the internet that they want to get weapons. They want to bring guns to these alt-right events. If some anti-fascist activist goes out and kills some conservative or someone they deem to be a Nazi, that could shift public opinion to sympathizing with these radical right groups. And I don't think that's what we want.
Well, I mean, you both brought up different circumstances, and I think that the circumstances are important, and also the quality of policing seems inconsistent from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, from protest to protest. And this strikes me as a complicating factor for both of your arguments. Lee, the police in Charlottesville did not intervene in many instances when violence flared up. As you said, those people were out for blood. A group of faith leaders credited Antifa for saving their bodies, maybe even their lives. They did play a self-defense role. And yet, George, in other jurisdictions, police have proven adept at keeping the sides apart. They've removed the need for physical defense. And that brings up the question of the utility of throwing projectiles or carrying sticks, et cetera, for the reasons that Lee brought up. It does influence public opinion. Why don't you guys discuss that a little bit? We'll start again with George, and I'm going to step back and let you guys talk.
Sure. And I think, I think to start a little bit with what Lee was digging into, this whole punching Nazis thing, of course, is not an internet meme. It's what happened to an actual Nazi, Richard Spencer, in the streets at the hands of an Antifa, activist. And I think we can't say anything about that, but to say that was an incredibly political event. It led to, discussions in mainstream newspapers, to thousands of people talking about whether it's okay to punch a Nazi and reflecting on their own experience, their own analysis of what Nazism and fascism is in a powerfully political way that I think was hugely productive and beneficial, and really pushed us beyond, I think, some of these, this sort of received liberalism that says, oh no, all opinions are fine, all opinions should be respected, and pushed us into a position which is now mainstreaming, which is the idea that, maybe there are some ideas that are not okay, ideas that involve the disqualification of entire groups of people from humanity and their subjection to being on the receiving end of violence. And I think one of the difficulties is when we find ourselves in a position where our biggest concern is the small amount of violence maybe that's happening on our side, when our opponents are actually organizing for much more serious forms of violence, collective violence, organizing, justifying those things, legitimizing practices, whether they're state practices or street practices that can injure and can hurt and seek to, destroy, huge groups of people. And I think this really needs to be our concern. Of course, we don't need to drive away public opinion, but I think the evidence on this is really complicated. If you look at, it's interesting to characterize Ferguson as the people in the streets being the victims, and I certainly see that element, but it also read quite publicly as a riot, as a rebellion. And this is part of why our moment is so defined by Ferguson, because riots often shift the tenor, and not only in a conservative direction. I think Keeanga Yamahtta Taylor has shown really well the ways in which the rebellions of the 1960s did not contribute in any significant way to a repressive backlash, but instead shifted white public opinion in sympathy with those struggling for civil rights.
Look, I guess this is maybe one of the points of disagreement here, that, punching Richard Spencer has led to this really kind of nuanced discussion of authoritarianism. I haven't seen that, right? Like, I actually see the very opposite. I see this kind of typical political thing where, it happens on all sides, where people are taking this extremely kind of marginal, tiny groups, these teeny neo-Nazi groups with a couple hundred members, and blowing them out of proportion. Like, these neo-Nazi groups and Richard Spencer are dangerous. They are a threat. No one denies that. So is ISIS. They're a threat. Nobody denies that. MS-13, they're a threat. Nobody denies that, right? But, this is a typical thing. This is misdirection where, the media and politicians typically just puff up these kind of scary boogeymen that fit kind of our Hollywood vision of what politics is all about, instead of talking about the actual drivers of authoritarianism, the actual drivers of inequality and exploitation. Like Hillary Clinton used the same strategy during the election last year. She wanted to talk obsessively about the alt-right. She did her Pepe speech. And I think that the cynical politics at play were very clear. I mean, she wanted misdirection to puff up these 4chan Nazis instead of talking about Wall Street, instead of talking about the greedy billionaires buying our election, instead of talking about the military-industrial complex. And, Donald Trump does the very same thing. And, he doesn't want to talk about the Goldman Sachs executives he's filled into his government, right? Like, he's puffing up MS-13, he's puffing up ISIS. Again, like, these Nazi groups, ISIS, they're all very bad, but they're not an existential threat to this country. If you want to talk about the driving force of authoritarianism, we should be looking at the corporate power structure. We should be looking at Wall Street. We should be looking at the military-industrial complex. These groups aren't controlled by these tiny marginal, alt-right organizations or these neo-Nazi organizations. Most of these groups only have a couple hundred members. We see this kind of mass hysteria on MSNBC and on the far left and social media, obsessing over these tiny groups while missing the forest for the trees, right? Like, we're not talking about the big defense companies. We're not talking about the big private prison companies. We're not talking about the real drivers of authoritarianism. This stuff makes for really great, ratings. It's great for politicians to get votes. It gets you a lot of retweets to obsess over these kind of marginal groups, whether it's ISIS or the alt-right. But I don't think that really gets to the heart of the discussion here.
Well, one thing I'll just point out is that one of the philosophies of Antifa is that you nip them in the bud before they can grow, before they become a real threat. I also would just say that I think that the research on whether the 1960s riots resulted in a backlash or greater sympathy for rioters is pretty mixed. There's quite a bit of there are arguments out there that it it did quite a bit to create a backlash. I think that you touched on something that was really important, George. Are all opinions fine? This is a central question. Emily Badger had a piece in the New York Times. She talked about how society has made clearer over time that people who hold racist views are consigned to the fringe, to marginalized. And she wrote, and I'll quote, "These norms may be fraying since the last presidential election, and particularly since white supremacists rallied this month unmasked in Charlottesville. The line between acceptable and ostracized views has started to become less stark." And what I wanted to ask about this, and I wanted to put this to both of you, is that one criticism of Antifa is that they have a loose definition of who is a fascist. The Antifa group in Portland, the Rose Antifa, they threatened to disrupt a parade because the local GOP was going to participate. And you can argue that Milo or Charles Murray provide intellectual support for white supremacists, but this was the mainstream GOP. These were conservatives, right? Where does one draw the line? And has Antifa does Antifa bear any responsibility for that sense that the line is blurry?
I think that's a great question, and I want to, I'll come to it through, through responding a little to what Lee said, which strikes me as really strange. Because on the one hand, there's this there's this sort of exaggeration of the violence of Antifa. Like people going around acting as if Antifa is engaging in a whole range of terrible, awful things, even making up some things that didn't happen, focusing in on a couple of minor little incidents as though they were the end of the world, and yet then simultaneously there's a minimizing of the threat of actual Nazi organizations, which, as we've seen, which should be utterly clear over the last week, are deadly organizations. Are organizations that even before this were shooting people, were engaged in in a whole range of violent activities. And so I'm not sure why we would minimize the violence of our enemies while kind of exaggerating the violence of our own side in an attempt to kind of undermine our own movements. And this gets to that question because, again, these are not fringe groups. This is very suddenly, a far-right movement that had, until very recently, and still has, to a great degree, a huge presence in the White House, huge leverage in the White House. This is the mainstreaming of far-right white nationalism. Bannon was not unrelated to these movements. He didn't uphold different ideologies from these movements. He represented them and pushed them forward in policy circles and represents a very clear threat. And this gets to this question of, and this is where it does get really complicated in line with your question, Joshua, which is that it's not clear always where the line is in how you draw these lines. I think, there are places in which the GOP is openly embracing militia leaders on a local level. And I think we need to be very attentive to that, try to disrupt it, try to prevent it. I don't think that means I've said this before, going out and punching my grandmother who voted for Trump or anyone else necessarily. But it means thinking very hard about these things. And I think it's also really unrealistic to think that a fighting movement in the streets will set out first and foremost from a perfect definition of who is who, and I don't think we can expect that. If we do, what we're trying to do is, I think, tie the hands of those movements. We need to work, of course, paying attention to messaging, paying attention to, public opinion, and paying attention to what it takes to build strong movements. But often that comes through really standing up, resisting. Antifa did not gain public sympathy by standing back and being passive. They gained public sympathy by standing up and being brave.
Lee, your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I don't know. Again, no one's against, defending yourself against violence. And if Antifa wants to protect people who are being attacked, I don't think anyone's really criticized that I'm aware of. You even see kind of very mainstream voices and even on the center right kind of defending them on that front. I think the problem is when you're calling for people to be an aggressor and go out and beat an undefined enemy, right? Like, who's a Nazi? It kind of depends on the person. Like, people I view as Nazis might differ from who you view as Nazis. You've talked a lot about punching as praxis, but I don't even know what that means. Like, if you're calling for students to go beat each other up, over Milo or some other kind of conservative provocateur, okay, but what about other powerful fascists in society? I mean, I live in the Bay Area. My area is home to powerful surveillance companies that are helping the deportation machine. Companies like Palantir, they're not getting targeted. Chevron is right here in the Bay. They funnel tens of millions of dollars to actual authoritarian politicians, the Republican Party, the big super PACs. They're not being targeted. It's mostly this kind of shock jock Milo guy that's trying to bait the left. I mean, are the folks who are encouraging people to beat each other up, I mean, are they kind of living by those same actions? Like, there are a lot of academics who have views that one could argue are fascist. There's Charles Murray, who believes that, intelligence is tied to race. That's kind of a fascist view. Are you advocating that people punch him? Or, even here in the Bay Area at Berkeley Law School, there's John Yoo. He was the legal architect of the CIA's torture program. If should people punch him in the face? I just don't understand this.
And I mean, we should acknowledge that this is a very tangled issue. If you look at the modern conservative movement, look at voter suppression, look at the criminal justice system. It is a fuzzy line, an increasingly fuzzy line. And right now you have a president who demonizes immigrants, people of color, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that I don't feel satisfied that we've really sussed out this issue, though. So let's put it slightly differently.
Joshua, let me respond to that, though, because I think there's this kind of attempt to conflate things with white nationalism and then kind of minimalize or simplify the debate without actually dealing with the material conditions and the actual history of how these policies came to be. Right? Like I saw on MSNBC the other day that they were comparing, gerrymandering and voting rights restrictions to the rise of the alt-right. That's crazy. I mean, I've covered, these laws carefully, and it's not the alt-right implementing these laws. This is another great example of using the alt-right to obfuscate what's really going on in society. Like back in 2010, 2011, there was a 527, basically a super PAC run by Republicans, loaded up with corporate cash, companies like Walmart, companies like Comcast, actually the parent company of MSNBC, that spent tens of millions of dollars to target state legislative races and implement these voter restrictions, these gerrymandered laws. That wasn't the alt-right. That was the corporate elite. But on MSNBC, they try to obscure these issues and say, oh, no, it's the alt-right that implemented all these policies. That's who you should blame. But in fact, it was their own parent company that paid for those laws.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this question is really interesting. This question is really important, the question of focusing on the real enemies, right? And I think I completely agree that that's something that we need to do. At the same time, we should be perfectly clear that, like Antifa, for example, they're not left liberals, right? They're not, the Democratic Party. They're anarchists. They're communists. They're people whose primary focus, actually, is on these much broader questions, whether it be defeating fascism, building socialism, or, things like prison abolition. And yet then when people pose those sort of more radical demands, pointing toward a broader horizon, pointing toward real structural, continuities with slavery and white supremacy in the present, then, I think, Lee, you back off, right? Like, you don't want abolition. You want to say focus on the real questions, but to do so in a sort of, very specific sort of way, not in the streets, but, through sort of, I'm not sure, research, legal struggles, strategies, but these people are focused on the deeper questions, and the very same movement.
Let's talk about the criminal justice system, right? Like, I see all this sloganeering and talking about punching Nazis and saying that the criminal justice system is run by the kind of alt-right white supremacist mentality, and you could look through history and kind of make that case, but you look at the reality today, it's not so simple. The New York Police Department likes to brag that they're one of the most diverse police departments in the world. They brag about their diversity program. They're obsessed with talking about community policing and community outreach. You look at the big for-profit prison companies that are driving the deportation machine, that are pushing for the mass incarceration state. Look at their board of directors. This isn't the alt-right. This is like a diverse board, including individuals that are involved in the liberal foundation civil rights establishment. It might be comforting to tell ourselves, oh, it's this group of 100 neo-Nazis that are running this country, and they're the bad guys, like this is some type of Hollywood film. But if you actually examine the criminal justice system, a lot of these institutions that are exploiting people, that are driving the problems that we're all talking about, there's really no semblance to the alt-right. There's maybe some intersection when it comes election time, but in terms of the day-to-day operation, not really.
But I think no one but the Democratic Party is saying that the alt-right is the only problem. I mean, this is where you have the Democrats coming out and saying, oh, Bannon wasn't the problem, Trump is the problem. No, I mean, not even Trump is the whole problem. And I think on that we can agree. But I'm just saying the far left is not making that argument.
I think we're getting a little bit off track. I'm sure, Lee, you're not denying that racial animus, white racial grievance plays a huge part in mainstream conservative politics, and right? I mean,
of course. Right. I mean, look. I mean, that's an increasing part of both Republican election campaigns and conservative media. Using ethnic fears, racial fears, gender fears. That's a big part of their political structure.
The sort of Southern strategy. This is all well-worn territory, but I want to flip back to this idea of defining who is so extreme that they should be kept out of the public discourse. And let me flip it around. We have these white nationalists, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, alt-right people, extremists in our view, certainly. And they're using this idea of free speech absolutism. They say that they're having free speech rallies. And I think that that's to some degree causing some of us on the left to say, well, free speech isn't all that it's cracked up to be. What about that value? What about the value of allowing a diverse of voices, and where do you balance that? So, I mean, this is another way into that question of who should be shunned from the public square and who should be argued with, right? At some point, a mainstream conservative, you argue with them, and a neo-Nazi, you don't. And where that line is tough. Do you want to take that?
Absolutely. I think this is really a defining question of the moment. And actually, I think it's really good that we're having this debate, because as I said, maybe in my, decades of life, I felt as though this has not been an open question, and yet suddenly it is. And it's good for us to be able to debate the limits of speech with regard to movement building, with regard to fighting against really, really brutal enemies. And for me, like, the line, roughly speaking, has to do with whether or not you think people are equal or not, whether or not you think entire groups of people are not subject to the same rights. Because even thinking just on the strictest level of speech, what you're saying, if you think that people are biologically or culturally inferior, is that they actually can't engage in speech, and that their speech is not going to be legitimate even if they do engage in it, even if they do have the legal right to go out and speak. But we also shouldn't confuse speech with, for example, platform rights, which is something that happens all the time. The idea that Milo or someone else has a sort of preordained right to be given the privilege to speak on a university campus or on television or other things. These things are not defined by high principles. They're often defined by influence and power and money and all of these things that have always structured and striated our access to speech, right? Not everyone really has access to effective speech. We've known that. The question is what kind of structures exist in that speech. And then, to get to what these limits are, at what point is it acceptable to prevent, a certain kind of view from being, from being expressed? And as I said, I think that has to do with whether or not they think people are equal or fundamentally biologically unequal. And that has everything to do with the fact that you also, when you get into that realm, in other words, a sort of fascism, Nazism, white supremacy, sort of Klan, when you're talking about things like the history of slavery, for example, you don't argue your way out of those systems, right? These things were never defeated by arguments. The better ideas did not win out. Those ideas were always bound up with force, always bound up with material struggles, and often the struggles of the oppressed themselves. This is what destroys, the institution of slavery across the world. This is what helps to destroy specific institutions that we would identify as fascist and Nazi. And at some point, this is because, and it makes perfect sense, because these are not rational, ideologies. People don't join the Nazi movement because they think it's rational or reasonable. They join it because it gives them a certain feeling and a certain kind of explanation about their own existence and their own reality.
Lee, is the line where you have to believe that all people are equal, is that a line that we should uphold?
Yeah, I mean, just generally, of course, that's an important principle. But getting to what George said, I don't equate, that Milo coming and making a bunch of bigoted jokes and trying to say some provocative hate speech is equivalent to chattel slavery, right? If Milo was enslaving people, maybe force would be justified. But he's out there to provoke people, to bait people. I don't think you could justify killing a slave master. I don't think someone should go out there and kill Milo. I don't think that's smart politics, and I think the comparison is a little bit silly and filled with political sloganeering. What Milo is planning to do, and maybe these plans have changed, but earlier this summer, it was reported that Milo plans to go to Berkeley, claim the mantle of free speech and set up a booth, and make his kind of really nasty, bigoted jokes. He's going to be there with a film crew, and he's going to hope that the left overreacts and attacks him, and they're going to film it and put it online and, try to cast themselves as the victim. I don't think the kind of responsible solution is to say Milo is a slave master and we need to use force against him like back in the Civil War. I think the more smart strategy is to ignore him, mock him, or, set up a boombox or a speaker and just play audio of him talking about how much he loves pedophilia. You can discredit him in many ways, but just taking the bait and running over and beating other students just seems silly and not productive.
I think, those are all interesting points. At the same time, there's this sort of, at the beginning you said these Nazis don't represent an existential threat, that Milo isn't really threatening anyone, except he was, right? Like, he's inciting violence against people. He's inciting the destruction of people's lives. This is clearly what he's doing, and it's strange to kind of downplay the importance of that simply because maybe it only affects a small number of people who very clearly are threatened by these movements. When the Klan marches, we can't act as if the Klan is not an existential threat to a lot of people, not deeply tied in with everyday violence that happens to a lot of people of color. And so I think we need to be clear that this is an existential threat to people. Just because we think Milo is maybe sort of ridiculous or a joke doesn't change, what he was actually doing and planning to do to people's lives. But the bigger question is, what kind of a left sits back, right? And I know you're not saying to sit back, and mocking is great. I think punching Richard Spencer is actually one of the most effective forms of mockery that I've seen recently, because it snatched from him his, something which was very important for him, which was his own ridiculous masculinity, and revealed him to be a kind of sniveling, whiner in his own videos. The same thing happened with the Nazis at Charlottesville. This is them being mocked, but being mocked through, engagement in the streets. I don't think there's a contradiction between the two. I think the problem comes then when, the right, of course, wants to use the question of free speech. This is a strategy. This is clearly part of their plan. And you could see that on the one hand as, we're taking the bait, or you could see it on the one hand as, well, no, like if we actually have a consistent understanding of what it means to, on the one hand, believe in free speech, but also believe in pushing forward a radical politics, that fights against our enemies in the streets, then we don't need to take the bait of wringing our hands about, the so-called free speech of people like Ann Coulter and Milo.
Yeah, so I feel like, Milo isn't unique. There are hundreds of shock jocks. Why there's such a radical left obsession with Milo makes no sense to me. Michael Savage is also in the Bay Area. He has an audience of something like 5 million. He calls for genocide. He calls for violence all the time. But I don't see people going after him. It's just kind of arbitrary. Just Milo's very good at getting under the skin of academics and people kind of on the university space. So people focus on him there. But, he's not really the driving force of hate. Fox News has a much bigger platform. Shouldn't that be more of the focus if it's only about hate speech? And just broadly speaking, as I mentioned earlier, is the only criteria for authoritarianism people that use this kind of overt hate speech? Because as I mentioned earlier, the driving forces of authoritarianism in society don't use hate speech, right? Like when the State Department was calling for bombing Libya and destroying that country, they didn't use hate speech. They used the language of social justice. They talked about taking out a dictator and promoting democracy, yada yada. If you look at the major police departments, if you look at the Border Patrol, some of the most abusive Border Patrol units, they talk about how diverse and inclusive they are. They're Latino-led, but they're still incredibly abusive. They just don't use hate speech. This seems like such an arbitrary definition of authoritarianism. The largest defense contractor in the world, Lockheed Martin, they brag all the time about how much they love diversity. They brag about how they have a female CEO, but that doesn't stop them from fueling conflict all over the world by flooding the world with weapons, by helping arm the Saudi military, bombing Yemen, killing thousands of people. If you're saying that we need to focus only on these kind of tiny marginal characters that use inflammatory speech to provoke people, that just seems so out of proportion given the problems that we face in society.
Right, but this is not marginal, right? This is, Trump comes to power. One of the first things he does is issues a statement that's saying that the police are basically going to be able to do whatever the fuck they want, and that the Department of Justice is not going to defend rioters and thugs, meaning Ferguson, meaning Baltimore. In other words, injecting a very mainstream white supremacy with a much more sort of sinister element, and putting that forward as policy. This is a huge question, and it's a huge existential threat. And when we sort of sit on the sidelines and maybe suggest that people are rioting and they shouldn't be, or they are thugs, then that doesn't help. When Trump issues this Muslim ban, these things are hugely important, and it's not as if they're unrelated to this emergence of a far right. The fact that this far right has multiple representatives in the White House. So I think I'll be the last one to let Obama off the hook, or Hillary Clinton, but I think the idea that these far right movements are not related to much broader policy questions and the very dangerous things that can happen with regard to that policy, I think is really short-sighted.
Gentlemen, let's keep it focused on Antifa, street fighting. Well, there's only so much we can cover, and obviously there's tons of structural problems, foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. Mark Bray, the author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, he said that the vast majority of Antifa work is nonviolent. This gets back to a point that George was making earlier. They do investigative work. They out people. They try to get them fired. They dox them. They try to shame them. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes that isn't about putting on a bandana and grabbing a broomstick and going and beating up white supremacists in the street. So nonetheless, physical confrontation dominates the media coverage. We get just a ton of this. It's a saturation thing. Antifa is the violent leftists that are on the other side of the violent rightists, and they give Trump the opportunity to say all sides are responsible. Lee, I know that you're in favor of nonviolent resistance to fascism and white supremacy. When you focus your criticism on these confrontations, are you perpetrating this narrative that these are a bunch of angry kids looking for a street fight that don't have a more sophisticated ideological framework about opposing fascism? And George, with some exceptions, Antifa are quite hostile to the press. They don't play the game. They consider most media to be irredeemably corrupt, including progressive and liberal outlets. And they get very bad coverage, largely because they don't play that game. And that idea that both the left and the right are prone to violence, that affects everybody on the left. That is something that blows back on everybody. Do they bear responsibility for that? Do you acknowledge that these false equivalencies are problematic for everybody on the left? George, why don't you start? Let's talk about media coverage, Antifa in the context of media coverage.
Absolutely. I think what we should think about, for example, is Charlottesville. Right. And it's not as though and I say that because it's not as though we can stand outside of a historical dynamic and act as though we know what the answers are, or we know how things will unfold, because we look at Charlottesville and what do we see? We see the media narrative shifting dramatically, in part because of the death of someone who was there identified with the left, organizing on the left, killed by a Nazi. In part because of the overt white supremacy that was being displayed, and the threats of violence that carried with it. And I think, so I think it's hard to say that it's the tactics of Antifa that are kind of driving this debate. When what we're looking at is this heightened moment of confrontation, of clashing, of a resurgent far right, in which many people in the mainstream, and this will seep into the press, will choose a side and will become more sympathetic with the side that is not openly, chanting "Jews will not replace us" in the streets. And I think we need to be open and flexible to those kinds of shifts in media narrative. I think it's difficult because on the one hand, the media is very hostile to a lot of these movements for the most part. And I think when a lot of time movements let the media into their spaces, they get sold out and they get, essentially hit pieces written about them. But we also need to play a much broader game. There's an article in the New York Times that I know a lot of people on the far left didn't think was perfect, but at the same time it was really good because it pointed out the mainstream importance of movements in the streets prepared to fight against white supremacists. And I think that's crucial.
Lee, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the other kind of problem I have with this slogan of "punch Nazis," it sounds good, but it borrows a lot of the same philosophy and rhetorical tricks of the war on terrorism. Who like, who doesn't support killing terrorists, right? Like, that sounds great, and you can use that same attack that anyone who disagrees with this strategy is supporting terrorism, just like anyone who disagrees with punching Nazis are, those people are allegedly Nazi sympathizers, right? But if you look at how both conflicts play out with the war on terrorism, there's a lot of non-terrorists who are killed, who are hurt, a lot of civilians that are killed. Same thing with this, punching Nazi slogan. It feels good, it gets you a lot of retweets. But if you look at actually who gets punched and who gets attacked, I mean, the elite, the power elite, and the actual Nazis are rarely attacked. I mean, if you look from Berkeley all the way through last weekend in Boston, a lot of the people who have been punched are not Nazis, right? Like, in a vigil for Heather Heyer, there was an ABC News photojournalist who got beat up and sent to the hospital, allegedly by Antifa. In Boston, there was an anti-racist guy who's, a white guy who's bald and tatted up, and people thought he was a Nazi and beat the shit out of him. He got badly bloodied. He wasn't a Nazi. He was there to protest the Nazis. And there are other reports of, like, at the Berkeley Milo thing, a student who was wearing a suit walking by because, that was the day of on-campus interviews. Someone said he looks like a Nazi and attacked him. I mean, when you have these kind of, proclamations that people need to fight an undefined enemy, guess what? Innocent people and bystanders are hurt in the process. So, it's a lot of silliness. And, I've lived in the Bay Area for a few years, and there are a lot of, well-intentioned, smart people who affiliate with Antifa that I know. I think they're good people. But, yeah, sometimes they're incredibly misdirected. There have been kind of these violent riots in Berkeley where they've smashed stores owned by worker co-ops. It's like that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't see how that advances justice. I don't see how that holds the power elite accountable. I don't see how that even hurts the Nazis.
Well, so I want to push on this a little bit. First of all, I do think that I wrote recently in The Nation that since the Vietnam War era, there has been the right has had a near monopoly on serious political violence. There are certain exceptions, but for the most part, the vast majority of severe violence in this country, political violence, has come from the right. And I do think that although it is a false equivalence, that the left and the right are equally responsible, Antifa is always center to that argument. The fact that there are people looking for a fight is a kernel of truth that allows this false equivalence to flourish in not only the right-wing media, but in the mainstream media as well. And then, Lee, I think that you didn't address my question about, do you acknowledge that this is a movement that goes well beyond, you keep talking about punch a Nazi. It is much more, it's a much more thoughtful ideology than just punching a Nazi. And when you talk to Antifa organizers, they have an easy understanding. They're happy to recite history. They'll talk to you about movements in the past and what's going on in Russia and what's going on in Europe, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, look, I mean, I've covered far right movements for my entire career in journalism. I've covered the anti-Muslim movement. I've covered the militia and sovereign citizen movement. I've confronted these people for a very long time. With adversarial journalism, with investigations. They are a threat, and I think a lot of these Antifa people are well intentioned, and a lot of them are doing the right thing. My only problem is with this call to go out and beat each other in the streets. That's very different from all these other tactics that you're referencing. I have no problem with that.
So, George, what about the alternatives? There was a piece that went viral this week. I think it was the Huffington Post that reported about this city in Germany, and they basically hold a fundraiser for their neo-Nazi groups when they march through town. They raise money for programs to de-radicalize Nazis. There was that famous North Carolina, I believe it was North Carolina, maybe South Carolina, where the clowns came and greeted these white supremacists, and every time the white supremacists would shout white power, they would throw flour in the air and say white flower or wife power, et cetera, et cetera. What about mockery? What about doxing? What about all of these other alternatives to violence? Are we looking at best practices here?
I think those are all, great responses and part of a toolkit that we need to be using. But if we don't set out from an understanding that these are illegitimate ideologies that need to be destroyed, then I think we're not going to get very far with any of those tactics, right? And I think the point is really to recognize the danger, to confront it, to understand that these are not ideas to be respected and to be tolerated and to be sort of greeted with open arms and debated with and discussed. I think the good thing about mockery is that it is precisely a response to an illegitimate idea, right? That it doesn't fall into this trap of thinking that we can debate and discuss our way out of this. And so I think these are crucial parts of a toolkit, as is everyday organizing, as is organizing against structures, everyday structures of sort of global colonial capitalism and white supremacy and mass incarceration. But precisely in these moments, we need to be able to shift our tactics as well to include things that maybe are more provocative, to include things that speak to mainstream concerns. There's a reason that when Richard Spencer got punched, everyone wanted to talk about it because it spoke to and entered into a very precise moment in which that was what needed to be done. And that doesn't mean that a year from now that's going to be the most useful tactic. But this sort of tendency to assume that it's not effective because it's too provocative or because it's too combative or because it sort of infringes on whatever kind of rights that Nazis are supposed to have. And I think that's not the right way to start. The way to start is with a flexible toolbox that understands, what it takes really to defeat an enemy. And often that does involve huge numbers of people engaged in nonviolent action alongside people who engage in much more militant direct action.
Lee, are you good there? I can pivot.
Well, look, I just to be clear about the Spencer thing, no one's sad that he got punched. That really doesn't matter. Just like I wasn't sad when Osama bin Laden was killed. Again, that didn't really matter at the end of the day. It's more this kind of mantra, the slogan that we can fix all of our problems with punching. It feels very macho and masculine, and again, it does very well in social media. The cable news eats it up. But if we take a serious, sober look at these problems, there are a few marginal people on society that get sucked into far-right extremist violent movements. That does happen. That's very dangerous. But, punching is not the best way to de-radicalize a lot of them. Some of the leadership, they're irredeemable, but whether it's someone who joins a gang or someone who joins ISIS or Al-Qaeda or someone who joins one of these white nationalist groups, there are many ways to de-radicalize through counseling. We've seen that very a successful effort to do that in Germany, in Norway. There are efforts here in the United States that de-radicalize both Muslim extremists and white nationalist extremists. I think it's kind of like this macho, let's smash our enemies thing that's, again, borrowed from the war on terror that feels good, but it isn't very thoughtful.
The idea of smashing our enemies, first of all, is not borrowed from the war on terror, but second of all, there are plenty of women, queer people, trans people, people of color who also want to destroy these enemies precisely because they want to destroy them. And it's not macho to want to actually destroy your enemies. And I think there are lots of ways to de-radicalize. One of those ways is to get smacked and to have a real hard look at what it is that you've been doing, especially if you come out of some internet community, you emerge into the sunlight as some of these alt-right participants have without any real kind of understanding of what it means to be a Nazi. And you learn very quickly in the streets that the stakes are high. And I think there are lots of people that will be turned off from this far-right movement because they're realizing that, that it brings consequences. We've seen that in individual cases. It's not clear whether or not it's a general phenomenon. But when these young kids get a taste of the understanding that people really find their views to be utterly and totally reprehensible, some of them will double down, certainly. But some of them will realize this is not for them.
But the question is whether violent confrontation is the way to achieve that shame, or getting people fired from their libertarian hot dog gig, if you know what I mean, referencing recent events. One of the things that I think is challenging here is that that there are these fuzzy lines that we keep bumping into. Let me ask you this, though. In the last 10 years or so, actually, let me go back. I'm old enough to remember the 70s, the 80s, and what was typical then was that you'd have a cluster of neo-Nazis or Klansmen, and they would be overwhelmed by peaceful protesters. George, one question that I have is, does the presence of Antifa looking for a fight, do you not think that encourages certain angry young men who are attracted to the fight itself to get into this movement that might have stayed on the sidelines in the past.
I mean, I think it's theoretically possible. I don't think that's the genesis of this movement that we've seen, because the alt-right did not emerge against Antifa, actually. I mean, it emerged out of the bowels of the internet and certain far-right groups, and began to gain space and began to make these provocative interventions in public life before anyone realized or thought that it was going to be about a fight. And I think when you look at, for example, the testimony of people who were with Milo and, engaging in these kind of activities, or, those around Richard Spencer, I don't think the idea was that they were driven by the fight. They were driven by putting forward these ideas, building a far-right community, and then mainstreaming that community by coding their words, not talking about white supremacy, but talking about white nationalism. And I think the goal was to do that. I think the response and the mainstream of Antifa has come only as a belated response to that. And of course, there was a long time in which Antifa was not, presented very well publicly in the media and in terms of public discourse. And that has shifted, as I think the understanding very rightly of these movements as very dangerous movements has shifted. The fact that there are some guys out there that want to fight, that was clear in Berkeley, right? When the Nazis marched with their sort of Captain America gear on. But then they tried to shift the narrative with Charlottesville. They told people to wear business casual, and they were trying to, put themselves forward as a respectable voice of the far right. I think, these are different strategies that they're using, but their goal is to mainstream. Right? Their goal is to take advantage of the Trump era, to take advantage of white resentment, and to try to make this into a broader movement.
Lee, your thoughts?
And I think we need to, again, kind of focus on, we still haven't defined this whole discussion, who's a Nazi and how hard do you punch them? Do you knock them out? Do you break their neck? I mean, why
are you so obsessed with that, though? How is that your obsession? You're obsessed with a single thing about punching Nazis.
Well, George,
the single thing about students allegedly fighting each other, focusing on some tiny numbers of cases that you dig up because you're clearly so obsessed with it that you want to dig it up. And where is the argument?
Let Lee finish.
All right. Well, I think it's important to define these terms. So I'll give it to you in a second, George. You should define this. I should note that this is a gift to the far right and a gift in many ways to the police. They constantly attempt to smear and undermine and delegitimize social justice movements, political movements on the left by unfairly painting them as violent. But more to the point, I would like you to define who's a Nazi. And in your own sphere, there are academics who are, one could argue, are Nazis. Are you going to punch them?
You've already asked this question. I've already answered it. You go back and forth on it like a broken record on Twitter about it, because it seems to be the only argument that you want to have is about this. You keep saying, I'm not against Antifa.
It's just
I'm not against direct action against Nazis.
Find any of these terms.
I'm not against. No, I'm talking about supporting actual existing movements and not undermining those movements.
So
it's not about slogans. It's not about. No, you're still on about this. Really, this is the only argument you've
You want other people to do the fighting for you.
Are you just going to self-own? This is just self-owning professionally right now.
Gentlemen, this is devolving. This is devolving. Let's move on. In the last 10 years since Heller versus DC, you see this open carry movement. It is now not unusual in open carry states to see armed goobers, heavily armed goobers attending these protests. They often have quite a bit of ideological overlap with the white supremacists, with the alt-right, with the neo-Nazis, but they maintain a distinction, and they say that they are not allied with them ideologically per se, that they're there to protect the Constitution and free speech, et cetera, et cetera. How does that, and for the most part, with some exceptions, Antifa are not open carrying. You do see it. In some protests in some states. There is this redneck revolt, for example, trying to take back gun culture from the right. But for the most part, it's not an equal, you don't see 50 armed militia guys on the left and 50 armed militia guys on the right. How does that impact this conversation? If you believe in direct confrontation, should Antifa then carry? If they do, are we setting ourselves up for a bloodbath where one person on either side can lose their cool, fire off a shot, and we have, obviously we can all imagine the monstrosity that might follow. Do we need to have a bloodbath like that before politicians will take the idea seriously that maybe we shouldn't allow people to bring semi-automatic weapons to protests? let's open up a little bit of conversation about open carry, noting that the Antifa movement started in Europe, where this was not an issue.
I mean, I think it's really interesting. So I was talking to some redneck revolt people in Arizona one time, right after the street fighting in Berkeley, and their response was really funny because they said that wouldn't happen in Arizona because everyone would be armed already. And so Berkeley was kind of this kind of California thing. Because no one was armed, everyone was beating the shit out of each other in the streets. And they saw at least some level of de-escalation occurring when they, for example, went to these far right, demonstrations armed. The other side was armed, and there was there's no kind of direct physical conflict. That doesn't answer, I think, the broader question, because I think, redneck revolt is doing incredibly important and incredibly dangerous work. And it's not just about arming people. It's fundamentally about transforming leftist culture in a way that gets beyond this sort of lefty liberal urbanite that despises the poor, the white poor in particular, and doesn't want to build any kind of cultural politics that will invite the white poor to be involved. And I think that's the work that Redneck Revolt is doing. Again, the guns are something that are important, but we shouldn't understand that to be the entirety of their politics, because their work is much more cultural and ideological than it is about the weapons themselves.
You think Antifa should carry open carry in states where it's permitted?
I think politically that could be important. I mean, I think that's precisely in some ways what Redneck Revolt is doing. I think to distinguish Redneck Revolt from Antifa is a little artificial. These are a lot of people who have very similar ideologies. And yet the question has to be posed, I think, in the correct way, which is, what is it that the left is doing when it comes to self-defense? And if that's a way of demonstrating to the right that the left is willing to defend itself and engage in this kind of defense, then it can be a powerful political tactic.
Lee, your thoughts on this?
No, I think it's completely irresponsible. I think if we start having activists across the spectrum all bringing guns to events, people will start shooting each other, and that's not good for left-wing movements. That's not good for the broader political context. And that this kind of gets back to our dispute a few minutes ago. I think a lot of folks on the left and in the kind of liberal middle are celebrating this violence, celebrating guns, without thinking through the consequences. They're not, practicing what they preach, and they're kind of like declaring that this will lead to some kind of glorious revolution without really detailing what will happen when people start bringing guns to peaceful political protests.
It's funny, I was speaking to an Antifa organizer, and he said that he thought that a bloodbath is inevitable and that we're already in a low-level civil war. I wonder what you guys think of that.
I mean, I think the violence is around us everywhere, right? I mean, we're talking about a mass outbreak of hate crimes after the election of Trump, which was not about Trump per se, but it was about people feeling as though this was their moment, right, to really express that repressed hatred that they've been, holding in for so long. And this is being channeled into these far-right movements. And I think the question is whether or not we can engage and struggle against those movements, destroy those movements, build a fighting left that can avoid precisely that kind of conflict and that kind of bloodbath. I mean, bloodbath is a sort of qualitative distinction. There have been deaths, there have been casualties, there have been many people killed, by far right, organizers, right, that have been shot dead. Students, people at rallies have been killed, and so rather than this kind of low level, bloodbath that's happening, maybe this person is speaking of something much bigger, and maybe that is in the cards. But the question of cutting off our legs at the knees in an attempt to not provoke, sort of ferocious, brutal enemies, I think is a losing politics from the start.
Well, we're almost out of time. I see we only have a few more minutes. I wonder if each of you would want to kind of give a final statement, a recap, and we can wrap it up in the next 3 minutes. George?
I think, again, we need to come back to the moment that we're living in, right? No tactic is universal over time. Whether it's nonviolence as the single answer, violence as the single answer, no movement, and I'm open to saying that no armed movement, no violent revolutionary movement has ever succeeded without mass nonviolent participation by a huge, sector of the population. And I would expect that people would recognize the opposite, namely the fact that it's very difficult to point toward nonviolent movements that have been successful without the participation of more militant and even armed sectors, precisely because our enemies are not going to hand over their privileges. We're trying to disrupt and destroy and overturn the entire structure of the world. And if we set out from the idea that we don't want to upset people or drive away public opinion, then that's going to hinder our ability to actually engage in the transformations that we want to engage in and to destroy white supremacy, to build a different kind of society.
Lee?
I think that the social science shows that nonviolent movements are way more successful than violent movements. I think anyone who's kind of listening to this debate should take a hard look at who's making this argument. If you think it's cool or revolutionary to go start punching people on your campus, to pick up guns and start shooting people you consider conservative or alt-right, or to do this kind of revolutionary cosplay of endorsing assassinations or violent revolution, just take a step back. Take a step back and think, who's advocating that? Are they practicing what they preach? Is this person potentially an FBI plant? We have a long history of law enforcement inciting violence, infiltrating left-wing groups to try to delegitimize them. Or is it maybe just a right-wing plant? James O'Keefe has infiltrated left-wing groups to try to incite this type of silly violence. So just take a hard look at the political landscape. We are in a golden age in terms of political organizing, of mass movements. There's a lot of momentum towards big political reform. I think people should keep their eyes on the prize, focus on achievable wins, focus on how to persuade the 300 million people in this country that a better way is possible, and don't get sucked into these kind of silly Twitter debates about punching people. I mean, because at the end of the day, what's the theory of change? Ask yourself that every time.
George, Ciccariello-Maher, Lee Fang, I want to thank you guys both for a really lively conversation. I really do appreciate it. I'm Joshua Holland. Check out my podcast, Politics and Reality Radio, and thanks so much.
Thanks, Joshua.
Thanks for having us.
So that was definitely an interview. What did you think, Roqayah?
I don't know. I haven't listened to it yet.
Neither have I. But we really hope that you enjoyed it.
Right. I heard it went pretty well. So,
yeah, positive word of mouth.
I'm looking forward to see how people react, because there will definitely be a reaction on Twitter. So I'm looking forward to that.
Which will not at all be addressed to us, to be clear.
Yeah, we are not involved in this in any way whatsoever.
Yes.
Thanks again to everyone that's been listening to the show. We want you all to subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes, because it really helps us. We also want you to make sure to go on patreon.com/delete your account and subscribe for as little as $5 a month, because it helps us make more awesome shows and have debates like this one that you just heard with George and Lee.
Yeah, and it also helps us have purchase more equipment so that we're not left recording off of our phones like you did today.
Right, that would be me. Yeah.
But, right, I mean, that's happened. I've sounded like shit for a while. But make sure to also look us up and subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher Radio. Make sure to tune in next week when Roqayah will be debating free speech with Michael Tracy. It's going to be really exciting.
Disemboweling Michael Tracy.
Wow. Well, I'm glad we didn't ask you to debate violence with Lee Fang. But not having heard the interview, but still being bound to tradition, the German word of the week is Nazi. Because a lot of people don't realize that Nazi is pronounced that way because A, the Z is a TZ in German, and it stands for Nationalsozialistische Arbeitspartei Deutschlands, or Arbeiterspartei Deutschlands. And it means the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. And that's obviously, people who are on the right will try to be like, oh yeah, well they were really socialist. And that's obviously not true, right? That was a thing that Hitler did. Like all fascists, he appropriated some aspects of the left into the right. And that's its own story. But anyway, there's your little linguistic lesson for the week.
Until next time, y'all.
Cheers.